I was going to ask you to think about how many people actually do not believe in climate change. What proportion of Australians do you think don't believe in climate change? There's been 4 years of CSIRO research, and it's actually only 8% of the Australian population who don't believe in climate change, who don't accept climate change. This is less than 1 in 10 people, so that's actually quite low. When you ask Australians how many people do you think don't believe in climate change, people would say about 23%. So people think that it's a lot higher than it actually is. Now, this is not an uncommon phenomenon. Psychologists know this very well, social psychologists in particular. It's called an injunctive norm. It's our perception of what other people think is right or wrong. And we always overestimate that. We overestimate the number of people we think do illegal fishing and think that's all right to do. So this is one of the characteristics of climate change, and this is important. So there's 2 things that are important there. The fact that it's a low number of people who actually don't accept climate change, less than 1 in 10, and that we overestimate it. So we can correct that injunctive norm, we can correct that overestimation. By making people aware of that, they might change their mind. So then I got to this side. So there's a small number of people who don't believe in climate change, but people who do believe in climate change, many people are unconcerned about it. And that's a group of people that is important. Now, people that are unconcerned about climate change, that's not necessarily a moral failing. That's something, there's other things that are important in their lives. A very interesting study by Chloe Lucas here at UTAS, whose work I'll quote quite a lot on. She investigated why people are unconcerned about climate change. What was it about those people? And it's important because we need to know the impact that we can have by making these people concerned about climate change, if you like. Well, people that were unconcerned about climate change, basically the narrative they didn't affiliate with was the Greenies. They were opposite to the left-wing power. So they associated climate change with the opposite to their own political perspective. Now, this is also not an uncommon phenomenon. A study in the United States found that Republicans and Democrats and the independents, in fact, all are concerned about climate change, or they say it's a concerning reality of today. So they're unlikely to call for climate action if they're unconcerned about well, the question I actually should say is that why do these people not take climate action, right, if they accept it as a concerning reality? It's probably best summed up by a Republican Congressman, Bob English from South Carolina. He said, all I knew was that Al Gore was against it, so that's why I was for it. So he basically said it's the opposite politics, therefore, and that's why things don't happen. Now, the same is in Tasmania with people who are unconcerned about climate change. There's also a rural and city divide. In this, people in the rural areas feel disenfranchised. They'll feel ignored, even though they're the users of they're the most close to the natural resources. They feel ignored and devalued by the politics, and they'll also identify with the opposite. So that is just some information about people who are unconcerned about climate change, and that's important. Now I'll get to some psychology. Basically, to communicate climate change is difficult because basically our brains are wired to ignore it. So there's 2 things that are called cognitive biases that we all know very well. One is it's a confirmation bias. So we basically evaluate information in a biased way. So you may think about a football game where you're watching the footy and somebody fouls against your team, or your team is fouled against, and the referee gives it a foul, a penalty. Now, you'll look for the information, that you'll evaluate the information in such a way that you say that the referee is biased or he's corrupted, or etc. So you will evaluate that event in your own biased way, and that's called motivated reasoning. So confirmation bias is actually when we access information in a biased way. So we'll look for the information that confirms what we already think. So these cognitive biases, they basically help understand this immutable stance that people take on climate change, which makes it difficult to communicate. So there's other things about climate change that make us ignore it and that make it difficult to communicate. It's a long way in the future. So as people, we overestimate the threats that are less likely but easier to remember, like terrorism. Basically, the climate change is something that is complex, and therefore we underestimate the risk of it. Climate change is really almost too big to believe. Its enormity is overwhelming. So our minds basically save us from sort of utter hopelessness by pushing aside the thoughts from climate change. And basically denial kicks in, right? We have this temporary self-preservation that happens. Related to this thing that it's too large to believe, the other thing about climate change is that everyone has to act in unison. The globe has to act to address climate change. Now, if you think about taking action, the larger the group, the more challenging it is to take action. So the fact that it's a global problem makes it difficult to communicate. Now, what you can do about that is to make the problem smaller. You can make it more locally based, and feeling part of a group, feeling empowered, can overcome some of that cognitive or that psychology that matters. The other thing, so that's the bystander effect, is basically that we stand by and do nothing if it's such a big problem that we can't handle by ourselves, that we can't affect alone. The other thing is that, as you saw, climate change is complex and it's non-linear. Now, people aren't very good at interpreting non-linear things that start slowly and then increase and then accelerate, because we don't really know. We're good at doing linear things. So if I buy a coffee every day and buy that every day of the week, I know that I spend $25 on coffee because it's a linear trend. My brain can deal with that. However, if something increases like was shown in some of the graphs, then we try to interpret it linearly as well, and we don't know where we're going to end up. So that's another difficulty in communicating this. So what does communicating climate science, what are the things how can we turn unconcern into concern, and basically to get non-acceptance into acceptance and to encourage action? So some of the findings that Chloe Lucas's study found was basically the first thing is to respect the difference. So unconcern about climate change is not a moral failing. It's something that people are concerned with other things in their life. So we have to respect this difference. We also have to listen. We have to build relationships around the different values that we have. We have to ask what's important. We have to empathise and that can help us understand what these core reasons are for the unconcern that can underpin that resistance to change. And again, that we can take that into our communication. We have to value other people's values. So it's good to find common values, common ground, and not to get caught up in disputes over facts. So appealing to the authority of science, for instance, or consensus of expert opinion is really a red herring. Lastly, we have to move beyond that left and right, and that was really obvious in that first discussion that I gave you about the unconcern. We can't conflate political ideology with a stance on climate change. We have to avoid this polarisation by showing that climate change is not a defining issue for a particular social group. And then lastly, to use communication, we use two processing systems in our brain. One is experience and one is learning by doing. Which is learning by doing, and the other one is analysis, is facts and figures. And you're getting a lot of facts and figures here today. But building experiences such as citizen science, etc., to experience climate change also will help us communicate.